So it's a great honor, obviously, for me to welcome our speaker, Corell, who is an adjunct professor at the University of Miami's Department of Ocean Sciences and holds a professorship also at the University of the Arctic. He's also a principal at the Envi-ronment and Technology Foundation, where he leads its Center for Energy and Climate Solutions. In his talk today, Science Goes Global, Bob is going to talk about his own journey, but more importantly, he's going to share examples of extraordinary scientific leadership. Many of you may not know that Bob led the conception, formulation, and implementation of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, USGCRP, which involved at the time 20 U.S. departments, agencies, and offices to study the Earth system and to ascertain the influence of humans on the system. His unparalleled personal dedication over the past 50 years is reflected in many awards, including the 1998 Edward A. Flynn Free Award of the American Geophysical Union, which came after he successfully established USGCRP. I actually didn't know that until I started looking up his bio. In 2003, and this is actually very interesting, 2003, there's a mountain region in Antarctic that was named the Corell Star in his honor. So it's such a big deal. Let's give him a round of applause. That's a big deal. And without a doubt, he has so many stories he's going to tell. So ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome our speaker, Corell.
It's a delight to be back here at NASA. As many of you know, strong connections here. When I was at NSF, I was probably here as frequently as once a month for 13 years. And my better half, Nancy Maynard, is still associated with you all here at NASA. So I want to talk about this idea that science really has had a magnificent journey that took it from working at scales that were impossible because we didn't have the tools to one in which we can truly understand the globe through the science that we do. Although the idea of a spherical world is really quite old. I won't spend much time on all of that, leading to the Flat Earth Society and all the rest, but let's give Pythagoras the benefit that he saw it long before most others. So I want to focus on these global scales and why they've done so well in changing the character of the science we do, and no place is better representative of that transition than this institution here. So I want to have a conversation with you, and I don't know whether our host would like it, but if you have questions real time, let's stop and talk about them. All right, so I'm going to start in the 1940s. In 1940, I was 11 years old, and I lived in a little village called LaGrange, Illinois, and I was a part of the Cub Scouts. Many of you know what those are. There were 6 of us in a little Cub Scout den, and nearby was a gentleman who had a car like this, which they call a Woody. And he came to us and said, I'd like to have these 6 boys come with me and have an adventure of what I've been doing for the last 30 years. He'd been going to Antarctica as a part of Admiral Byrd's team. And he had been there on every trip. And he was sharing that with us, showing us the clothing he wore, telling us the stories of what it's like to go to a forbidden planet, a forbidden continent on the planet. And so he shared with us his experience on the first expedition, all the way down to the planning for, at which they ran the first series of capability studies to lead into the IGY. So this is a really interesting beginning, and I thank you all because it took me a little time to say, how should I start this? And I thought, holy moly. I'd forgotten it, and not one of my kids knows this, and nobody in the world, because I've never told the story before. And also, you'll see me dressed in quite different accord than is my norm. But I'll let that story come out when it's appropriate. So that's the beginning. That's the beginning where I began. Franklin Delano Roosevelt paused and said, science made a huge difference in what it is we can do as a nation. And he then commissioned Vannevar Bush, only months later, to deliver a report called The Endless Frontier, which I'm sure everybody here has read. And if you haven't read it recently, pick it up and read the front end, and you'll find so much of what is in your very blood is in that, to create new scientific knowledge and develop the scientific talent. In other words, to build our capacity as a nation to have scientists. And then Senator Magnuson, only days later, in 1945, put a bill in to establish this so-called Bush Endless Frontier program. And so the first out of the box was the establishment of the Office of Naval Research. And look at the time scales. Do you believe that could happen today? I would argue almost impossible. But they are moving on time scales of days and weeks. And finally, in May of 1950, they decided to establish NSF. So the grounding for much of what we do came out of the Bush report and came out of the institutions of ONR and the establishment of NSF. The rest we'll talk about as history. So there's a copy of the document. The only copy I could get a hold of was threadbare, and I took a picture of the cover, and you can read for your work if you like, but basically it says, it's key to our security as a nation, for better health of our people, for more jobs, for higher standard of living, and for our cultural progress. So that's the grounding of who we are in many, many ways, I'd like to argue. And if you disagree with me, speak. So now let's go to the 50s. So we did get the IGY. IGY was actually proposed by our National Academy of Sciences in 1952 and implemented to really do the first of what are really global scale sciences, but not with many tools. Most of the tools were those that we have that we can put on boats or airplanes. Even then, airplanes were tough. But then Sputnik hit. And Sputnik was coming out of this incredible tension between our two nations, Russia, the Soviet Union, and ourselves. But only 4 months later, we launched ours. So obviously we're ready. Both nations were all ready. You just don't do this overnight. You don't design a satellite. And I'm not sure where it is, but all of you, I trust, know who designed and built Explorer 1, JPL. So, and you'll see why in a minute. So NASA was formed around that time to create the capacity to do this. So actually the capacity for NASA to be on the front page was already buried in a number of places within our government, coalesced to form an institution that would marry all the work we had done in aeronautics with the other two legs, that which is planet Earth and that which is the solar system and beyond in which we live. But 60 years right now, almost to the day. Still young by my standards. All right, so ONR then really didn't get around to actually having a grants program until 1959. Following Sputnik, NSF started doubling budgets, or the Congress did, to really move NSF along. They even created things like the National Defense Education Act. Why? And that is to fill this gap of creating a capacity in our nation to have a group of people who have the scientific, engineering, and mathematics background or to do the job. And then Clark Kerr, president at the University of California, followed by colleagues at Dartmouth, began to rethink the role of the university. Obviously, the university is the nest for which all of this should then rest, in which it can grow, but it's going to be done on a decentralized basis, on the basis of what universities do. So rethinking the role of the university or the use of the university was really important. And I would argue in reading a lot of Clark Kerr's personal notes, he really was influenced by Sputnik and by our launching of our satellite some days later. So here's the Sputnik 1. My trust is that most of you have seen this, but probably don't know these things. These are the things that the Russians decided they wanted to do by launching it. Most of which I would argue is kind of technical. Being able to get a bird in space and maintain it there for some period of time. It didn't last very long, as you probably know. But they wanted to know they could talk with it radio, whether optical methods that could be used, and could they really build the technology for pressurized satellites. And it's fairly small, about that big. Even though it weighs about as much, a little less than I do, to be blunt. So that's what happened on October 4th, 183 pounds, only 20-some inches in diameter. And then we launched ours only 4 months later. And we decided, thanks to the role of our teams that put this together, we wanted to do serious science at the beginning. So we put a cosmic ray detector and a meteorite package in the satellite. And I think most of you know, this is the radiation measurements that led to Van Allen, for whom Van Allen belts are named. The second objective was to really look at these micrometeorite impacts, and so there was another test on the satellite to do that. But by and large, a fairly simple satellite to do its job, but the overall objective was similar, to create the technology to do it. But I would argue this started the real pathway that enabled science to think about going global. And here are the three individuals who were powerful in it. Pickering on the far left was at that time the director at JPL. Van Allen in the middle, who designs the instruments that went aboard it, and von Braun, who knew a lot of technology that brought from Germany and carried to the Redstone Arsenal, which is where this whole thing got born in order for us capability to do it. So from that, we had a new opportunity, because at the same time with advanced planning, not knowing we'd have satellites, the International Geophysical Year began. Lloyd Berkner said it's time to really think about this at the Academy in 1952, and only 5 years later we actually did it. And I don't need to tell you, because I think you all know, but it really was a geophysical experiment to understand the geophysical characteristic of our planet, and to do it now, the prospect of having satellites which have a global perspective became a really powerful alteration in the final planning of what sorts of things could be done on the ground or above the ground in airplanes in order to take advantage of that emerging technology. So it gave us a new tool, unparalleled capability to understand the geophysical and some aspects of our natural systems. But there was something happening in the background. And this is an area in which we all care about. We're not always capable or worry that we're not capable. But Walter Sullivan at the New York Times came along, and he led a half a century of talking about, telling us about science and why it was important. And he talked about it in terms that the public could understand. He said, order and logic is seemingly endless, almost a quasi-religious experience to see how all these pieces are connected in ways that our minds are not capable without having data, analysis of the data, and some understanding of how that's connected in some creative and maybe innovative way in our mind. So Walter Sullivan he's the guy who did it. He did it forever, and I would argue he born this idea of talking to the public about how science is really moving into a global sphere. He did this for his entire life, and for those of us who had the privilege of knowing him, it was a privilege to actually have him help you understand, like me, how we could talk better about what it is we do in language that John Q. Public can understand. So now let's move into the 1960s. So we're really starting to move things. We created NCAR back in 1960 to enhance our understanding of the atmosphere. We created a really interesting development. I don't have the time, but to talk about the formation of IASA, the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, is arguably one of the more politically nested in the politics of the world, where Lyndon Johnson and Russian Premier Kosygin began a series of talks saying we can't do anything, but we could talk about science together. And let's create the mechanism, the tool by which we can talk together, and maybe it'll grow out of science into, and if you ever get a chance to listen to Lyndon Johnson's recordings on this, it's really stunning. He really understood that he was doing something that was really important, that had long-term implications, let alone to be able to establish a team that would be able to work at both long and near-time emerging scientific issues on global scale. And NSF began all these years later, 8 years later, started really thinking about putting this stuff in an applied research and bringing in the social sciences, which had not been a part of NSF in its early days. So during this first decade of NSF's life, things began to happen. And I'm only picking a few of them, but I think this is one of the more important observations. Let's move to the 70s. So after that conversation, they did in fact create IASA and gave it a global environmental responsibility. Created the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. Had not been in existence until 1976, and it's designed to really help both the President and the Congress, and hence the public, better understand how science, engineering, and technology play a role that is important to our economy, our national security, etc. Then NOAA got created. Story about NOAA. NOAA is the only agency of the US government created by an executive order. It does not have a legislative home. So it could be dissolved in a minute if somebody wanted to, which is not going to ever happen. But the president at that time was Nixon. And the head of the Department of Interior was Walter Hickel from Alaska. And the two men did not see eye to eye. I cannot use the words that are in the transcript because they're too naughty. But the basic end of that was, Nixon, I'll be damned if I'm going to put this new entity that's concerned about the oceans and the atmosphere next to the agency that has responsibility for the Earth, USGS, and create an entity that has a holistic view. I'm not going to give that to Hickel. I'm just going to pop it over in the Department of Commerce. And that's how it got there. And I have the paper, so it's not speculation. And I would love to use the words, because you know as well as I do, some of these individuals can talk, shall we say, coloring. So NASA began to really seriously about Earth resources and monitoring. And out of it, as you know, some years later, we created EOS-DIS and another little story. Shelby Tilford, whom many of you know, was really the godfather that helped us as a nation realize that a constellation of satellites measuring all kinds of capabilities of how the Earth is functioning, decided that the data part of it ought to be around 40% of the budget. It's that important because it's not only taking the data, it's creating data products for science, data products for the public, data products for industry and the like. And it was 40% of the budget. By the time we started really launching those satellites, we were down to 10% of the budget. Because every time we turned around, there just was never enough money to get the birds in the air, and we would chop away at this until, I don't know what that budget is now as a part of EOS. Some of you here might know better than I. But it was, in fact, the host of this decision in the early 70s to create the capability to do it, which we now call the NASA Earth Science Data System. And then we launched Landsat, which began, as you all know, to really begin to understand some of the footprints on the planet. And people to this day will herald that day of that. So throughout the 70s, there was a wide range of studies and publications and building and understanding at the global scale. And we created entities such using ICSU, which is now, it used to be called International Council of Unions. It's now called the International Science Academy, to our National Academy, to Conservation Nature, to UNEP, and then most importantly, in the late 1970s, the Academy really documented this into a document that really became important to us as we began to think about how we build a global change program which would have a major component dealing with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's still really remarkable document. So now let's look at some of these new capabilities that are on the table. This is a history of climate models that go back to the 70s when we began to have individual models of the atmosphere, land surface, and oceans, began to connect them. But how did we get there? It's too many words, but what happened in 1963, we signed an agreement to limit test bans so that there would never be a test of a nuclear weapon or a nuclear system underwater, on land, or in the atmosphere. And the United States decided that in order to sign that, we had to have the capability to understand how those weapon systems might operate. And as a consequence, there was an explosive development of supercomputers led by Cray and IBM, and there'll be others that you could name. But those are the systems that we began to see popping up on the table as we began to think about how we could expand this modeling capability brought to us by the singular development of supercomputers for other purposes. Now, of course, there are all kinds of new stuff coming on the table that we brought to the table, but the origin is that we could go and say, you've got this capability that Cray built to understand how nuclear weapons function. We need that capacity to do studies on climate and the global scale processes that are so important. And so they did. And I would argue that that process really set the next dimensionality beyond satellites to be able to understand how science might move to the global scale. So some really interesting things happened during this era of the 80s. And I can say this with some confidence that President George H.W. Bush, his science advisor was Alan Bromley. PCAS, the President's Council of Science and Technology Council, had been formed. And other White House staff, notably the Chief of Staff, John Sununu, helped engage seriously in this issue. How did they do it? First thing that George W. Bush did, he took his cabinet and cut off people in the cabinet who did not really have an agenda on this issue. But Department of Labor was there because of people. And you could imagine, there was like 2/3 of all the cabinet were restructured to deal with this emerging issue. And in a minute I'll tell you how it was that this came about, because there's another development that's really important. But so he created this sub-cabinet of cabinet members. That cabinet met on the time scale of every 1 or 2 months in the White House, in the Roosevelt room, dealing with these issues. And who would be there? You guys, scientists, would come and give briefings on what you know. And it led to a number of contentious arguments, because John Sununu, it turns out, I had known pretty well, because when I ran the oceanography program and marine science program at New Hampshire, he was governor. And for a weird reason, I had to report to him on my budget. So he knew me very well. You'll see another reason he knows me pretty well. So one time he calls Alan Bromley and says, we need to meet. I don't believe this crap that's coming out of this science crowd. I don't see that the oceans and the atmosphere are connected. I don't understand it at all. So we ended up in his office with a number of other people, and for 2.5 hours, we went at it. And my job was to share with him how it is that we know the science connects these things. And he was unaware of many of it because he had a PhD, but it was in mechanical engineering, so the science stuff was somehow over there, but yet he knew enough of it, of the physics, to be able to contend with it. And at the end of it, he stood up and he said, Corell, the problem with you is you know what I know, and I know what you know because we were both graduate students at MIT at the same time. And that's not good. This would be 89-ish, 90. Bush was in 90. John Sununu and I would go at it frequently over these issues until one day he said, I understand what you're telling me, but I want to be able to see it on the models. Believe it or not, NCAR, with the help of Warren Washington, we brought a full climate model and installed it in a place I can't talk about, but he could go to and run the model. And out of that conversation, he began to understand that the systems are inexorably coupled, including the landmass. But the oceans and the atmosphere are completely coupled. And he never quite was able to say, I believe it, but he never fought us again, ever. And I'll tell you why that helped a lot, that we went through this challenging 2.5-hour discussion, which of course got replicated over and over again. But I would argue it led us to take these, start to couple the models by the time we did first IPCC, and then we increasingly couple them, and now we begin to test them against each other to be sure we have some understanding that no one model can really capture it because they don't have all the same physics, chemistry, and biology. All right, so now we go back to IPCC. Those first models had resolution of scale about 500 kilometers. You can't even, that's Europe and England. The second, we dropped that in half. Whoops, sorry. Dropped it in half to 250. Third, about 120. And by the time we got the fourth, we now be able to see the texture of Europe with Norway and Sweden and in the EK and so on, being able to be seen in the models. And it took us all that time to get the resolution because while we got to 50 meters, here's the problem. That's kind of the rule of thumb. You want to double the resolution, you're going to have 10 times the compute power. Those are not firm numbers, but it's order magnitude. You have to have that capability. So something else was happening around the same time in another scale, on another global perspective. There was worrying about continental spreading and drift and so on. And there had been a number of measurements that showed that Earth's magnetic field flipped. And yet, why would it spread out like that if something wasn't moving? So the U.S. Drilling program said, let's test it. So we took the Glomar Challenger and we went off the coast of Africa and South America and drilled 17 holes in 17 different, that's sort of there. And guess what? Now you could date them really well. And it was a boom, boom, boom. So that which is closest to the spreading center is young, that which is far away. And that gave us another global perspective, which then got tested in many other spreading centers around the planet. And they all confirmed the same finding that, can you imagine the science communities had been arguing forever about continental drift. It had been so contentious that people would yell and scream at each other in conference rooms and at AGU. All right, so let's move on. Here's where I want to talk about some geopolitical things. And the reason I want to talk about them is in my view, they made a gigantic difference. Here's the first one. Sir Crispin Tickell, about 95 or 6 years old. At the time, he was Margaret Thatcher's, one of her science advisors. And he came in to speak with her one day and said, there will be 400 or more million people on the planet who will be displaced by sea level rise. And she said, you gotta be serious. Because I don't think we have climate change. How could that be? How could we get that much sea level? And that most of it would be in the Commonwealth, in India and Bangladesh, places that had been a part of the empire. And so she told him, I want, in number 10 Downing Street, I want briefings every 2 weeks for the next 3 months, all afternoon, by the best scientists in the world, because I want to hear it direct. I don't want you to tell me. And what most people may not know, her baccalaureate degree was in chemistry. So you could talk to her about science, because way back when she had that science background that enabled her then to think the way all of you in this room are able to think and not really know that that's happening. So we had a suspicion that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were very close, both politically and elsewhere. And what happened is that Margaret Thatcher did a 180, She said, it's real. Up until this time, Reagan was fighting science. He was cutting off science programs at NSF, at NOAA, even in your shop, saying we don't need those because this is just a waste of our money. And all of a sudden, one day, I got a phone call and said, we need to talk. So he had his chief of staff come over, and he said, the president suddenly has decided climate change is real. And we're prepared to work with you. This is 1987. That blew our minds, because we had been fighting uphill on issues of a global scale science. And were those two people ever talking about it? Until Charles calls me up and says, I want you to come. I wanted to find out, did they ever talk? And thanks to you, in the buried archives in London is this photograph with a caption. The two are at the mic saying, we are collectively convinced that climate change is real and that we as nations should lead the world in dealing with this scientifically. And so out of that came a budget initiative. I'll put this up first again. In 1987, we were just really borning the Global Change Program. It was still borning as a cooperative venture among the group of us from mostly NASA, NSF, NOAA, and eventually DOE. Excuse me. But they made the proposal at the Office of Management and Budget that the president wants in his 1988 budget a presidential initiative to study global change as a science. And it's in his State of the Union address, and it's in this budget. That became our linchpin to develop the US Global Change Program, because we now have a president of the United States who everybody thought was not on this page, but there's why. He and Margaret Thatcher had come to the agreement, and that series of number 10 Downing Street briefings were jointly put together by the Brits at NERC, the Natural Environment Research Council, which is kind of their NSF, and those of us working on the development of global change, at that time, largely NASA, NOAA, and NSF. And this budget initiative, you can go out. I went through the 1,000-page document. I found what I thought was it, but those things get buried. But it is the only presidential initiative that we know about that carries the president's name on actually implementing a scientific research program bigger than, say, one agency. So that's that. Now I want to go to Gorbachev. All right. In the 1st of October, 1987, Gorbachev gave a really stunning speech. I urge you to read it. You have to read it 3 times to get the result that I'm going to tell you. But a group of us had been asked through a kind of back door, if you will, to provide some information about his speech about the Arctic, which occurred during the summer of 1987. And so he then said a number of things in the speech, but let the north of the globe, the Arctic, become the zone of peace, and let the North Pole be a pole of peace. And let's go on. What does that really mean? He proposed that we establish some new entities, a scientific coordinating body that now has like 19 academies of science called the International Arctic Science Committee, formed in 1990. In 1987, we signed a 5-year agreement on science cooperation, and we began those initial discussions about doing an international space station. These are all kind of things you can dig out of the literature, and so what does all that mean? Well, it can be argued, and if you read it 3 times, you'll come to this conclusion, and I'll tell you why I can speak with some, I hope, credibility, that it was really a speech about the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So when you read it 3 times. It's not all that long. And in the middle of all of this stuff happening, right after his famous speech, I was in Russia at the Institute of the Lithosphere, negotiating the next section of the ocean drilling program, of which you know a good deal, I'm sure. And the director said, let's go to the US Embassy to the party. And I said, how do we get there? He said, we'll walk. I said, it's about 5 kilometers. That's okay, we can walk. And we walked, and in about 10 minutes, he said, I want to warn you, if they find us, they'll never know where we are ever again. We'll be gone. Because he proceeded then to tell me that this speech was, in fact, the announcement, subtle announcement about the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he gave me the facts. For example, they weren't ready to make the transition in 87, 88, and 89, so they had a new premier appointed, Andropov. Andropov had terminal cancer, and they knew he couldn't live for more than a year, and he didn't. But they put him in there as a hold. And after that, Gorbachev came in, and the rest is history. Now, I'm probably going to catch hell for the story of telling like that, because when I came home, the State Department was all over me for weeks, trying to sort out this whole story, and only time would tell that there is a connection. And they did make real agreements out of that speech and others to increase scientific research and to have space cooperation. Now, I would pause for a moment and say, you know, what I've just done here in 20 minutes or so is a pathway that is hard for me to comprehend actually took place in those years, because we're all, forget about who's president right now, but the last 20 years, 25, 20 years or so, these things did not happen that way. Remember, we launched a satellite 4 months later. We established an agency a year later. We set up NASA. We did all these things. There was a common sense of wholeness of our nation that is hard to see today, and I'm not going to blame anyone. It's a part of a transition that's occurring worldwide, and we just happen to have a bigger signal right now than some others, but it's there if you travel as I do. So those give you some idea. There was some political basis to be optimistic, and because these all occurred in that latter years of the 80s, we could then, in fact, begin to build the story. All right. So major investments in the United States. You know, I'm not going to take a lot of your time because I think most of you know the Goody report back in '82 and Herb Friedman's report that helped really create the International Geosphere Biosphere. Francis Brotherton, I'll say a few words about that, and really was a foundation for Mission to Planet Earth as we know it today. The first was the impacts on habitability out of Goody's report, but that kind of hung in the conversation that we're talking about something that isn't just doing science for science. We're doing science as a nested responsibility in our nation, and has to do with our nation's capability to deal with its own habitability, and those are others. So the Brotherton report became kind of the hallmark because it was really detailed, and there's a detail. I think everyone here has seen that crazy diagram. But I could tell you, while this was being nurturing the beginning of our commitment to do climate and global change research, Jack Fellows will tell me he still has the report, and he was at OMB, working, as you'll hear in a minute, doing things that made a lot of difference for us as a nation and as science. But he said each one of the pages he would peel off and look at. Are these guys doing what the community is saying needs to be done? This was the community speaking in ways that he believed at OMB and elsewhere needed to be done. And Francis Brotherton in '86 began that process that led NASA to really grab onto this through its Mission to Planet Earth. So during that time, late '80s and throughout the early '90s, we built the first elements of the NASA's Earth Observing System. And while you can't see it, I found out the launch date for every one of them. It's in the diagram if you want to have it. It's for you. And they really start in '87 and go throughout roughly a decade to get long-term global observations, learn land surface biosphere, blah, blah, blah. And so EOS continues to this day with all of its follow-on. We called it Mission to Planet Earth in those days, but it's got a bigger kind of footprint today. But it is really the tool by which we went global, and we could drown truth everything because we had the ground program to go with it. So I did a little digging. There are, last year, something around 650 operational satellites. I couldn't get the breakdown very well, but a good number of them, even a number of the communication satellites, are being used for scientific purpose. So I can only say that many of which provide data that helps us support this series of science going global. So in that same time period, we doing this at NASA with some NOAA coming along, shall I say reluctantly in those days, less so today. But we established things on global scale. This is really a really incredible job that was done, the TOGA program. I think most of you know by title, but Michael Hall at NOAA said, I am going to take responsibility to deal with interannual climate variability, including El Nino. And you know that's history. We now have the capacity from having done TOGA, which is a ground-based, ocean-based, plus satellite program that leads us to major breakthroughs where we can begin to project something about the El Nino. Still not perfect, but it's operating on multiple weeks and maybe even on a month or two. Then we did the World Ocean Circulation Experiment over that 10-year period. First time we ever took a snapshot of the behavior of the ocean, every ocean basin on the planet. And so we have a time series beginning. We need to do it. And Ghost Ships is trying to do it, but it's nowhere near as comprehensive. So big holes that we don't have covered. But when you do a snapshot, that's merely the beginning. And yes, we have some rates and things because we did it over a 10-year period, but it's much too short to do much. But WOS really did do the groundwork in the ocean to go with and you couldn't have done this without satellites, but literally a devotion of our entire fleet to do so. And then there was one that doesn't get much attention, there was a similar thing on the Arctic because it was seen then that the signal-to-noise ratio in the Arctic was so much bigger than it is on global scale that we can learn some things there that we can project to other scales. So today, the World Climate Research Program has still going things, everything from, the cryosphere to, again, ocean variability, energy exchanges, and still working on the troposphere and the stratosphere and its role in both everything, including ozone. Anyway, that's kind of a snapshot. I put a lot of words on here, not so you should read them, but to get the idea. Lots going on, all simultaneously, all with one long-range goal, is to better understand the planet. And you guys here at NASA, including your sister groups like JPL, have been stunningly important in implementing that program. So I won't spend any time there, but all these things got going in the late 90s and into the 2000s, all focused on taking science, in other words, doing things on the ground which the satellites can use for CalVal and better understand how the system works. All right, then another thing happened. I think most of you know Chicxulub, Yucatan Peninsula. There's a artist's rendition of what they think happened, and that artist's rendition has been around for a long time, but it wasn't until this, that on the outside of Florida, even though Florida was much bigger because sea level was much, much lower, but we're way over off the continental shelf. And I happened to be on the ship at this time. This is not an original core. I couldn't find a core, but we found a spot about that big that created just huge amounts of iridium. Like 2, 3, 4 orders of magnitude more than the background noise. And most of you in this room know that there is some iridium, but nothing like that. And the nice part about it is we could date it. And we were able to date that little piece of iridium on the outside off the continental shelf of Florida to 66 million years. And that pretty well confirms that Chicxulub really was formed by a meteorite, because it had to be an extra planetary source of the iridium to be able to do it. So, you know the story. Massive changes on the planet, and the evolution afterwards is totally different to the evolution of life prior to the Chicxulub event. So another thing, IPCC, you know what was formed to do, I don't have to tell you, but it was created by WMO and UNEP. IPCC was prepared to do comprehensive review of science and recommendations to governments, and it is chartered to do the things you all know, because my guess is that many of you, if not all of you, are somehow involved with IPCC. And you saw from that modeling diagram, we're now on our way to the 6th assessment. Now, I'm wrong about this. Mid of the 80s, late 80s, NSF really started to push the science on our side at NSF. And then here's the story. In 1987, the then head of NOAA decided that we should have this program. And he designed it from the top down, and he brought all the agencies together, including Eric Bloch from NSF and Secretary of Interior at that point, I've forgotten. And he proposed this idea, and they all walked out on him. Eric Bloch grabbed me and says, "We're leaving." And I said, "What's the matter?" He says, "You don't design time program from the top down. They have to come from within." And he said to me, "Get to work." And he said to Mike Hall, "Get to work." He said to Shelby, "Get to work." And the head of NOAA then, whose name I'll pass on right now, within 2 months resigned and retired, because it was such a massive defeat in front of all his colleagues that he couldn't use a top-down method to born science. You guys would never throw a satellite up and say, "Hey, I got good data, you want to use it?" No, that's not the way it works. And I watched you guys over the years. You were really good at getting your homework done. So these three guys, every Friday for 10 years at 8:30 in the morning, met at the Holiday Inn on C Street to try to be sure that we maintained the momentum, raise the questions, going back to the full committee, going to all our agency homes, and try to build what became the Global Change Research Program. But for 3 years, it didn't have one. So what does it do? I told you Reagan has this budget, that should be 88, sorry. Then we had these ad hoc agency working together. Jack Eddy. Anybody remember Jack? One of the great minds. The Mondominium should be named after him. But we asked him to put together an interdisciplinary team. And what he did, I think we should do again. Every summer, after all the agencies had worked together with the academy, would come up with the next year's budget and program. And then we would go to Colorado, and in that room would be the agencies, scientists, and an equal number of people from the committees on the Hill. And it was that way in which we could then build a community of people who understood what we were doing. Not we, but we as a collective group of scientists. Sorry. And Jack led that process, and it went on until the mid-90s when it sort of fell on soft times for another story. But what we had was in OMB, two individuals, Bob Grady and Jack Fellows, understood this. Bob Grady had been a speechwriter for George H.W. Bush when he was vice president, and he became the agency person in OMB. He actually went around and made deals that every single science agency reported to him. And that meant that others had to give it up, and he had to give them something. And those guys helped us immensely in developing the climate and global change agenda. At the same time, Congressman George Brown and Bob Palmer were our friends on the Hill, because George Brown was chairman of the Science Committee in the House. And they too helped us. We had Bob White, at that time, president of the National Academy of Engineering. He got the Academy involved in this process. And so they produced this idea of our changing planet and then said, oh, we got to do something about it. And so they wrote a law. George Brown, Bob Palmer, and Bob Grady in OMB, and over in the Senate, the Senator, my brain which went south. It'll come in a second. But he chaired the Science Committee over there. And those two people, George Brown and this other senator, each put the law in as a draft, and it became law in November of 1990. Here's another case where we really didn't get started on this in any substantive way until 86, 87. So in that time period, and Bob Grady said, if we don't put this in law, the next president will not do with it. Not because he's against it, but he wants his own agenda, or her own agenda. And so the law became really the linchpin, and it provided us with all the tools that you all know so well. So let's now pound our way through a few years. All right. That act requires that the Global Change Program agencies, in concert with the community, produce every 4 years a detailed assessment of science underpinning climate and global change. It can't be just climate. It has to be global change. And that report came out April of last year. And when it was decided how to release it, it's supposed to be released by the White House. There was no committee, hadn't been formed. There was no OSTP. There was no mechanism. So what they did is they took this report hand-carried to the 14 agencies that had to agree to it, and get the signature of every single one of them at the highest level, namely the secretary or the agency head. Pruitt signed it. Zinke signed it, and so forth. And so they had all the signatures, and then they just went to the print, and this is what we have with these sort of summary findings, very high confidence levels. Things are stuff you all know. I don't need to bore you with it, but there are 6 of the major findings that they have, and these are clearly different from what you gain in the newspaper about what the United States has done. And I give credit to those who actually carried this through to its completion. And the carbon report and the impacts report are likely similarly to come out within the next month or so. And they're doing the same thing because that machinery is not all there, even though we have a nominee for the head of OSDP. It's not also to be, at least in its current formation, to be a science advisor to the president, but at least head of OSDP. So these are the key things that enable us to move forward as a nation. We are clearly in this new arena where science really is operating at global scales, but increasingly, I want to know what's going to happen at this chair level. I don't mean it literally, but at a much more local level. So I want to march through some of the things that lead me to the conclusions I would like to make. So in 1988, we began to build IPCC. The first draft of the IPCC agreement, ultimately signed after obviously some modification, was created here between this committee of 4 agencies and the other agencies, but mostly those 4 guys, and EPA, which had a very different view about how we should do this. Their view was we and every nation on the world should do our own assessment, and then we'll group them all together. Well, I think everybody in this room would realize that that just would never work. And after a lot of battles, we ended up getting IPCC formed, and the first meeting of which was held in the State Department in early '88. Then we got the Global Change Program. Then we got more support from all of this, getting the UNFCCC formed in '92. And I would argue that more people drop the last sentence. They say concentration, blah, 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 and then the missing word at such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt to the changing climate, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed. Those are words that are often left out, but I think they give texture to the first sentence that we overlook. So now we're ready for science to go to a next transition, to extend our scientific capability to a new dimensionality. And here's what I'd like to argue with you. I'd like to suggest that it's time for us to transition from science going global to science going global and beyond. And what are the elements of beyond? Let's talk about that just a bit. We're going to face an unprecedented future, no question about it, in so many people's mind. Klaus Schwab over at the World Economic Forum argues that the 21st century, he calls it the fourth industrial revolution. It's just going to happen in ways that we just can't comprehend. The change is occurring at such a pace that we are not able to jig around and adapt very rapidly because it is so rapid. It's not just the climate's changing. The geopolitics are changing. You saw what happened over the weekend, how a dynamic between the US changed overnight. We don't know much about how it'll unfold. So we have to create mechanisms by which our ability to adjust and adapt, we have a management strategy within science to adjust to the new realities, which we tend not to do so well, but could do better. So it's going to affect our legislative process. It's going to be unparalleled in its development. And so I would argue that's one of the ingredients of being able to recognize some of these changes, this adaptation in a very rapidly changing environment that we have here. So what are some of those things? I'm going to put some words up because I see. If you just map out all the things we worry about every day, they're all exponentials. And they're all changing on time scales that are crammed up from about 1950 today. And so those are things meaning that we're going to have to deal with things like economic and social disruption, which we know actually is occurring, and it's going to have an effect on our ability to build the institutions to implement our programs. We're going to be more and more a knowledge-based society focusing on socioeconomic issues. We're going to need new management tools. We're going to have greater transparency, and the biggie is everybody's expecting a much higher return on the investment. I don't mean, in percentage, but when we invest in science, we want something out of it. So you see universities shifting their gears to become more attached back to the world in which they were born, and is likely, will of necessity, integrate some of these things into the culture of our community. So we're faced with some new opportunities, but they're going to be requiring us to think differently than we have in the past. So my argument in conclusion is that we're going to have to go beyond where we have been. It is a new framing. The challenge is now for us to science to more directly contribute to positive social outcomes. That doesn't mean we do the research for that purpose. We do the underpinning research necessary for that to happen. It's a facilitation process as opposed to an applied research program focused on that idea. You have the capability to integrate on global cutting edge, but also to cut across scales. So not only global, but more local and actually on more rapid temporal scales. So we will remain dedicated to the idea that our job is to produce the best scientific knowledge that can possibly come from the brains of humans and the tools that we have, but that they increasingly constructively contribute to the good. So that's my word about science, go global to now going beyond. And with that, I'll say thank you.
So good job, man.
Thank you. My pleasure. It's always a pleasure to see familiar faces in the room as well. So thank you.
Quick observation. When we are 84 and you are doing 1 hour here, it's not easy, So anyone with a quick comment? For Bob?
Well, I was interested to see how early it was stated in that process that social scientists should be integrated critically with what's being done. Yet here we are today, and that hasn't happened.
Yeah.
And of course, the thing driving a lot of those exponentials that you showed is population.
Exactly.
And the UN currently forecasts those populations, assuming our climate forecasts are okay, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Forecast the climate, assuming the UN things are good. And
No, you're absolutely right. I had a chance to meet with a group in a Rotary Club down in Key Biscayne, and I brought tangentially population. You got to know your audience when you open your mouth. And the former president of General Motors leaped up out of his chair. He said, "You're so right, but you're not saying it. Get your mouth open and tell people that the energy, climate, population issue are inexorably connected, and we need to know better about how that works." So it was nice to know that somebody who was very recently the head of General Motors. Thanks for the comment. I appreciate that.
Okay, so with that, let's thank Bob one more time.
Thank you. My pleasure.